The Commission on Aging and Persons with Disabilities has been a fixture in this town for a very long time. And we're making a concerted effort to try and bring programs and topics that are of interest to everyone in the community. It matters a lot to us. And so if any of you have ideas about programs or projects that you would like us to work with you on, if you have something you'd like to share, please feel free. Stop and talk to Stephanie or Rebecca. They'll make sure that we hear about it, and if we possibly can, we'll reach back out to you so that we can talk about it and try and meet your needs as best we possibly can. So this morning, as advertised, we're bringing you John Mills. Some of you may have seen him on Channel 61 or Channel 30. John is a trained genealogist, an independent scholar, a published author, and the president of the Alex Breanne Corporation, a Connecticut-based nonprofit. The Alex Breanne Corporation focuses on research into the lesser-known stories that represent the life experiences of the American enslaved population. The intent of the corporation is to provide current descendants with their hidden history. They can then inject the formerly enslaved into the landscape of the communities where they lived, where they worked, and where they died. John's goal is to remember the forgotten, to apply critical thinking to our history of chattel slavery as a means to find solutions to the ripple effects it continues to have on our lives every day today. So please, let's all welcome John Mills.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me move this out of the way. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I'm going to try to stay out of the way of the screen. Let me get that off the screen. Move that. All right. But thank you for having me. I appreciate it. This is wonderful to be able to talk. I love kind of this topic and sharing my research and our process and the projects that we have and how we do it. And so it really is a delight to be able to talk to you all today. I appreciate you guys coming out to join me in this. So I'm the president, as you heard, of the Alex Breanne Corporation. It's a nonprofit that I started back in 2022, not too long ago. It's named in honor of my youngest daughter. There's reasoning behind that, but it's a long story. So come talk to me afterwards, and I'll give you those details. But it's named after my youngest daughter, and it was created to organize around genealogical research that I was already doing for some 30 years, but I didn't have a process for funding the things that we did, and so it was all self-funded. So everything I did was all out of my own pocket. And it wasn't well organized. It was kind of a lot of ad hoc stuff. And so in 2022, I decided to put more structure around it. So what we do is we do research into the formerly enslaved, as you heard. We find somebody way back in time. You know, somebody that was just mentioned once in some document. Like, you know, some enslaver just says, yeah, and then I sent Prince out to go get a bucket of water. And then you never hear from him in any other document ever again. Like, we find those people, and then we start to dig into, well, who was that? Can we find anything else? How do we get greater detail, paint a picture around who they are? And then we actually do reverse genealogy. We start tracing back to today to find somebody who they're related to, so that we can then hand that person everything that we've discovered. And then the second piece of that is, how can we then inject that person into the community where they lived, worked, or died? So that's what we do. And so I'm gonna walk through some of our projects and some of our process and what even brought me to that. So that's me right here in 1972. And that's my mother and my sister and my father. I grew up in California, in San Diego, and as you can see, I was kind of a goofball. But I grew up in Southern California, and my dad was a Vietnam vet, And also as the Panthers were organizing in California at the time, and the US organization, which was a competing organization in California at the time, they had same principles, but they operated differently. But during that time, my father aligned to the teachings of both the Black Panthers and the US organization. So he would talk to me a lot as a young child about being prideful in my skin and my features and my hair, and right, he was like hard and fast trying to inject pride in who I was into me. You know, that resonated, I guess, to some degree. I thought it resonated in totality. I would have told you I was this incredibly prideful black man as a young teenager and a young adult, right? That's me on the right in the middle, and that's my wife on the left and my three daughters. My oldest, Jasmine, was born in 1989, and I entered the workforce. And while I was in the workforce, it was in corporate America where I realized that how I presented to the world was not the way I thought I was thinking. I thought, again, that I was this really prideful black American. But I actually realized early on in the early 90s that I actually saw my skin color and my blackness as less valuable than whiteness. And it was very clear in how I functioned and how I treated white Americans and how I was operating in corporate America. And when that clarity came to me that there was something unconsciously causing me to treat people differently and see them with greater reverence or less, that freaked me out, especially considering who raised me. So, and where I was raised and what I was raised around. So that freaked me out and made me realize that if I have an unconscious bias like that, who else is walking around here like this, thinking that they're the proponent and they're actually a part of the problem, unconsciously holding up pillars that affect us all today? Like, who else is doing that? How do I affect change in a world that has people that think they're good, God-fearing people, yet they're a part of the problem? How do I get them to self-interrogate, look in the mirror, think about how they're presenting? And so, and I was fearful for my kids. I was like, are they gonna grow up and be in the same place? If my father couldn't stop me, what hope do I have to stop them from coming to the same place, right? And so that was my challenge. I didn't know how to do anything with that. So in the mid-90s, my sister comes to me. My grandfather, that's him on the left, his name is Milan Mills. He was born in Henderson, Texas. As far as I was concerned, he was like Adam, like God just dropped him on the planet. Like I didn't know anything about anything before my grandfather. And he never talked at all about where he came from. I knew he was from Texas, but that's all I knew. He passed away in 1987, patriarch of the family, so the big, huge thing, and lots of pain in our family over that. But in the mid-90s, my sister tells me, I know about his family. I've done some research. I figured some stuff out. So I was like intrigued. I was like, what do you know? And she says, well, his mother's name was Eliza Mills. His father's name was Robert Mills. His grandfather's name was Ned Mills. And his grandfather was enslaved in East Texas and was freed on Juneteenth. And that was my first true tie to enslavement. Like, you figure you're an African American, you likely have something in your past around slavery. But I never had the details. I couldn't pinpoint it. And my sister in the 90s gave me that pinpoint. And so then I wanted to know more about these people, right? So she shows me this death certificate, and she had this picture of my great-grandmother, my grandfather's mother. And I'm like, where you get this picture from? she said, I contacted his people in Texas. I was like, what? Turns out they had pictures of us. Like he was sending things home, right? So they knew who we were. We just didn't know who they were. And so then they were sending pictures back to her once she reached out, which was fascinating to me. She also found my great-grandmother's death certificate. And she was showing it to me, and there were some things on it that instantly piqued my interest. The first thing was she died on October 28th, 1918, of Spanish influenza. Right off the bat, I knew what that was. That's the flu pandemic of 1918. She said, that's right. So now I not only had a tie to enslavement, I had this tie to a moment in American history. Like my great-grandmother died of that pandemic. She told me also, look at the bottom. And at the bottom, it had the name of the cemetery where she was buried. I was like, oh, we got to go there. We got to go figure that out. That's where our people buried. Let's go figure that out. And so we planned a trip. It took us a lot of time before we built up the courage and the nerve and the time and learned enough about the people that we would be around. And so we were in email and we were over the phone for years before we thought, okay, we're going. So in 2003, we made the trip. And we got there on July 3rd, and on the 4th of July, 2003, we went to that cemetery. That was ironic. We weren't planning it to be the 4th of July. It just happened to be. And so we got to the cemetery, and it was a pristine cemetery, like beautiful, well manicured, beautiful. And it was a bright, sunny East Texas day, and the stones were, it's a small cemetery, but it was beautiful. Every stone was beautiful. So we didn't know where they were, so we just started walking the cemetery, and as we walked through it, we realized no one we were related to was buried there. So I was thrown, she was thrown, but then I noticed this lightly driven path along the outer edge of the cemetery, and she kind of had like a somber look. She's like, let's go walk this, and I guess she kind of figured it out, but I hadn't. So I just started walking with her. We walked this lightly driven path into the woods, and then once we get into the woods, then we start seeing like down trees and gravestones of people we were related to. If you can see kind of off into the distance where we started, outside of the woods, you can see the cemetery where we started at.
Was it segregated?
Yeah, it was a segregated cemetery. And so the front part was whites only. And so all the black people had to be buried in the woods behind it. And so up till that date in 2003, there was a church associated with it. The church manicured the white section, but left the back section as it was. So we were literally, stepping over down trees and pushing away, decades of leaves and like literally just to see stone. And then I had to process the walk I had just taken. Because I realized once I saw that my grandfather and his brothers and sisters carried both their parents past that same pristine cemetery while they're carrying them to walk into the woods. And that concept I had to think about. Like, what was society telling them about their parents' worth? Right? Like, if you had to see that, what would you then internalize about your own worth? If you know you can't, you're not that, you got to go back there. And it married some things in my mind. It married my father trying to stop me from allowing what I was seeing to do what it ultimately did. It made me realize that what ultimately happened with my mind probably wasn't by accident, right? There were influences that got my mind that way. And it made me realize it was historic. Like, I had ancestors that saw things as well, that probably did the same to their minds, right? And so, like, I was much more interested in, like, how far does this go? Where are there other areas of our family where I might see something like that? My sister then shows me That was my father's father. By the way, I also learned that day that Mills was the name of my great-great-grandfather's last enslaver. So I also had to then process, I'd had this hard and fast genetic kind of pride in the name Mills. But now in that moment, I had to process that Mills was just the last surname of the last person that owned my family. Right? It was the first time I'd ever had to process that. And that was that whole day was a telling kind of learning moment for me. I learned that my father's mother also was from Texas, different part. And I knew her mother. So I knew my great-grandmother. She lived in San Diego as well. Her name was Tony Lee Kyle. She's in the lower far right. But my sister shared with me that she learned that her mother's name was Mary White. And my great-grandmother's grandmother's name was Marguerite. She was enslaved to John and Keziah White in Texas, Irish couple who had this enslaved woman. John took advantage of Marguerite, and the product was my second great-grandmother, Mary. I knew that my father was fair-skinned. And you see that in the earlier picture that I shared. Like, he's very fair-skinned. But I never knew why. If you asked the people in my family, they would have been like, well, we got Native American, in our family, Probably a common thing that we all hear. Yeah, they tell you that. What I learned was, no, that was from that relationship in the upper right with the Irishman who raped his enslaved that produced my great-great-grandmother, Mary White. And thus, my great-grandmother, Tony Lee Kyle, who I knew was born in 1984, was also fair-skinned, and thus it passed down to my father. The Kyle name of surname of my great-grandmother, I learned was really kind of a famous name. Her father's name was Kyle. Her grandfather's name was Sam Kyle. They were all enslaved to a man named Claiborne Kyle in Texas. There's a town named after Claiborne. It's Kyle, Texas. He was a politician in Mississippi, and he offered to put up the money for a friend of his that was in jail so he could get him out. The guy skipped bail, and so now he owed all this money. And so he fled Mississippi to Texas. In fleeing to go to Texas, my family was enslaved to him. He told them, you can stay here and I'll have to sell you off and your family be all broken up, or you can come with me to Texas. And so they decided to go with him for fear of the family being broken up, and so they were raised in Texas. Coincidentally, I've spoken with descendants of Claiborne Kyle, and it's really wild because they speak in terms of, you should be really happy that he decided to bring you to Texas. Really wild. So anyways, me and my sister decided to go to Kyle, Texas. We were going to go visit the graves of our ancestors. And so we went there. And he has his own cemetery in the city that's named after him. And by the way, Texas A&M plays at Kyle Stadium, if you didn't know that. There's more to this. And so that's me standing at the grave site of Claiborne Kyle, the enslaver of my family. On the right, you see behind me that tree line? I had to walk back there, and on the right, that's us back in those woods. That's where we started finding our family. Same scenario, right, as the last one. Segregated in life and in death. What is that telling someone's mind? On my mother's side, my mother was in a military family. My grandfather, John Smith, heavy Navy guy. Heavy. He died in 2007. But I was a little kid. He would be saluting me anytime I walked in the room. I'm a little kid. He would salute me. everything around his house was a Navy piece of memorabilia everywhere. He was heavy, heavy Navy guy. We didn't learn until after he passed away. He knew nothing about his family, by the way. All he knew back to was his grandparents. That's this level. He only knew back to his grandparents. He knew nothing more than that. He was raised in Baltimore. He met my grandmother while he was stationed in Panama. She was from St. Thomas, and they moved to San Diego after they were stationed in San Diego. His great-grandfather was also a heavy Navy guy. He didn't know this in life. I wish we would have known this and could have told him before he passed. But his great-grandfather's name was William Cooper, fought in the Civil War, served on a bunch of different ships in the Civil War, the Commodore Perry, the Wyalusing, the Albemarle. One of those ships was a captured Confederate ship that was recommissioned as a Union ship. He served on that ship. And then after he passed away, or after he got out of service, he goes back to Baltimore, of course, after the Civil War, and lives out his life there. He dies, and he's buried at Laurel Cemetery in Baltimore. Laurel Cemetery was a very famous cemetery in Baltimore. A lot of prestigious people were buried there. It started as a cemetery in the early 1800s where the enslavers would bury their enslaved. Then it just turned into where freed African Americans buried their loved ones. So it was a huge cemetery. It went into disrepair and was sold off. And in the 1960s, it was paved over. So it's a parking lot. So that's me and my sister standing in that parking lot in 2021. My third great grandfather is buried under that parking lot. A mile down the road is Loudon Park Cemetery, which is the national cemetery where all the people he would have been fighting alongside are actually buried. And I've been working with Loudon Park Cemetery to at least get a cenotaph, a memorial stone there for him. But the VA will give me the stone for free. But Loudon Park ain't doing nothing for free. They're like, okay, $5,000 and we'll let you put that stone here, right? So we're working on that. I'm also working with many different people. There are people that are working on that parking lot, by the way. Dr. Elgin Kluge from Coppin State and a few other people are working on capturing the records of all the people that are under that parking lot so that they can have a memorial alongside it so that you can tell the story of what that actually was. They've been working on that for some 3 years now because much of the records are gone as well. So they're reliant on descendants who have records of their family being buried there with death certificates to come to them and go, my family's there, right? And we're just one of them. We're one of the 30,000 families that would have to contact him in order to get that done. So again, this kind of paints the picture, right? My work is about the idea that there's history that was erased, history I didn't know, history that was affecting my perception of myself, that had I known, may have had me functioning a little better, at least eyes wide open. So it's about giving this gift that I was given by my sister that helped me realize how ingrained I was in this country's history and how my family were strong, persistent people that because they were able to endure all of that is the only reason I'm able to stand here and talk to you today. So I see them in a light of reverence, right? And we don't teach it that way today. Today, we teach, we're allowed this handful of people that we can revere, right? Our kids go to school and they learn about Martin Luther King and Medgar Evers. They might learn about Frederick Douglass. They might have this handful of 5, 6 people. But I had grown now to revere the million side of that 1 in a million equation, right? My mindset was those people you know nothing about, they just persisted in life, they were enslaved, they survived, they procreated, and then they died. Their stories are gone. To me, I wanted to flip the whole thing. tell the story with them at the center, with the reverence they deserve. So that's what my nonprofit does. And we do it with intent to help families like the way my sister helped me. No cost. We're not charging them anything. We do the research, and then we hand it to them, right? That's what we do. I also started to realize that even when I did learn stories about the people that I was related to, or people that I had a connection with, it was often being told from a perspective that didn't align to my perspective. That was something that was really interesting to me. I'd read this book years ago. It was called Newgate of Connecticut. It was about Newgate Prison in East Granby. And in the book, there's this chapter. And the chapter talks about this guy named Prince Mortimer and about how he had been enslaved in Middletown and he brought here as a little kid in the 1730s. And he's working for this guy named Philip Mortimer in Middletown. And the Revolutionary War came, and he was a servant to officers, including George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And it talked about his slave journey on the slave ship and about how he was just like dark as night. It talked about how in the 1790s, he was promised freedom by his enslaver. His enslaver dies, and the son-in-law challenges the will and wins, so he stays enslaved. He was like in his 70s at the time. It talks about how 17 years after that, he's like 87, the enslaver received his morning chocolate from Prince, and he swore he saw something floating in it, and he said that's arsenic, so he goes with the authorities, and Prince is sent to prison for life, and he's sent to Newgate Prison. And then the story ends that he died at 110 years old, and thus ended his unhappy days or something to that effect. So it's like 2 paragraphs of just that story. And I wanted to know more about Prince Mortimer. I was like, this is fascinating. Like, I don't see him as a criminal. I see a lot of other people as criminals enslaving him for 110 years, but not him. So I wanted to know more about it. I realized there was another book written in 2006 by a Simsbury man named Dennis Caron. Dennis read the book, and after he read the book, that book I read, the previous one, he decided to write his own book and do deeper research. But in the preface of his book, he says something. He says, frankly, this passage, talking about that passage I read from the other book, did not make any particular impression on me at the first reading. The appeal of Prince's story struck me only after I reflected over the dates that Phelps mentioned. Prince died in 1834 at the stated age of 110. So he was really fascinated by it. He lived 110 years. And that was nice for me, but that's not what I was fascinated by. I had just walked all these woods. I couldn't find my enslaved ancestors. Sometimes there'd be a marker, sometimes there wouldn't. It was hard to figure out where they were. They were constantly behind cemeteries. Some are under parking lots. So the very first thing that came to my mind when I read it was, where is he buried? Is he under a parking lot? Right, that was the first thing. I wasn't thinking about his age. That's the first thing that came to my mind. The second thing that came to my mind was all this stuff that my father had talked about, learning about where his color had come from. And he had told me once, he said to me once that, he grew up in a black community in California, and he used to say, I often wanted to scratch the skin off of my face. Like, he didn't even like that he was fair-skinned. He hated it. He talked about the treatment he received from white America and black America. Right? So I had his pains all in my life's experience. So when I was reading the story and hearing how they were talking about Prince and how he was dark and black as night, my mind went right to colorism. Like, I hadn't even gotten to think about the 110 years yet. Right, like my mind was thinking about completely different things. I was thinking about the trauma of that journey he took as a little kid. I was thinking about the fact that there was so little documentation on Prince, which aligned to what our struggles were in trying to find information about our family. So those were kind of the things I was thinking about, and that's when I realized who's reading the primary sources is actually incredibly important. Like, who's actually looking at this stuff? Because if it's a narrative that's been written by a person that doesn't have the experiences that would then be affected by that history, then they might have blind spots. There might be things that they're not even thinking of. It's not intentional. They just don't see it, right? And that also drove me to the work that I do now. I started finding that concept in a lot of the things that I would eventually research. A friend was telling me about this story once about this woman named Prudence Crandall. And in 1832, in Canterbury, she ran this school, Canterbury Female Boarding School, right? And she had this African-American person who worked there who had a niece named Sarah Harris who wanted to go to school there. And Sarah Harris asked Prudence Crandall, can I go to your school? Like, I want to learn so that I can go teach other young black kids, because they can't go here. Like, I want to teach me, and then I can go teach the black kids, right? And Prudence had to mull over that, and she eventually went, okay, I'll let you into school. But as soon as she did that, all of the parents of the young white kids pulled the kids out of the school. And so she went, okay, Prudence Crandall, that's all right. We'll just make it a school for young black girls. And so then young black children from other states started coming to Canterbury to be at Prudence Crandall School. Town didn't like that. I'm crunching this story down in the interest of time. But ultimately, they attempted to burn down the building. They passed a couple of black code laws, and eventually she had to close the school down. In less than a year, she had to close the school down. Today, if you go to the State House, you walk through that corridor that walks from the main building to their office space. There's this huge display of Prudence Crandall. They call her our state heroine. There's a statue in the rotunda at the state capitol of Prudence Crandall and Sarah Harris. And Sarah Harris is represented as this small child, and Prudence is this tall teacher. There are a couple things that strike me when I see the story. I think what Prudence Crandall did was fearless and amazing. But there's a clear disparity. If you go to the South, there were teachers that stayed and taught Ruby Bridges. There was one. There were teachers that refused to let the Little Rock Nine not have somebody teach them. So they stayed and taught Elizabeth Eckford while everyone else said no. But when you hear the story, you guys can't tell me the names of them teachers. You might be able to tell me about the heroism and the heroic nature of the kids that asked to be taught and walked through mobs, even though white Americans were behind Elizabeth as she walked with her books, screaming and yelling at her. There's pictures all over of that stuff. You know those images. You know the kids. But you don't know the teachers' names, right? You come to Connecticut and you don't know the kids. There were many other black kids. You only know the teacher. That to me, there's a clear disparity. Like, what is that? Why here in the North we have made the kids less important and made the kid the heroine? Whereas if you go to the South, the kids are heroic for their bravery and you know less about the teacher. To me, that meant something. It told me something. The monument at the State House, Sarah Harris was an adult when she asked. She was likely taller than Prudence, but she's represented at the State House as this small little child, like, right? And the imagery of Prudence is not only at the State House, it's also at the old State House, again represented as our state heroine. I just think there's a dynamic there of importance and value, limiting the pride and fearlessness of these young black women here in Connecticut. In the middle, William Ellsworth, he was an attorney at the time. He eventually became a governor of Connecticut. But he agreed to take Prudence Crandall's case. So he's a part of the story often when you hear the story. They'll bring in William Ellsworth. William Ellsworth is brought in other scenarios in our state as well. His name comes up when Nancy Jackson's story is talked about. Nancy Jackson, I'll tell you a little bit about the story. It was first, the most famous pieces that talk about Nancy Jackson is in a book written by a man named James Mars. He wrote a slave narrative in 1869, I think, 1867, 1869, around that time period, of his time enslaved here in Connecticut, and his family's escape from slavery. He wrote this narrative, and then he also talks about, in the 1830s, living in Hartford and being a deacon at the Talcott Street Church, famous church in Hartford. And in the back of his book, in the appendix, he tells the story of some man coming to talk to him one day, telling him about one of the parishioners of the church who was an enslaved woman, that her enslaver wanted to take her back to Georgia. They weren't from Connecticut. Wanted to take her back to Georgia, and this man wanted to write up a writ of habeas corpus, meaning a petition to the court to have that enslaver bring Nancy to court, because he saw it as she was illegally enslaved, because we were not a slave state at the time. And they thought from a law perspective they could get her out of slavery. And so, but for whatever reason, they wanted James Mars' signature to be on this petition. This abolitionist didn't, I don't know the reasoning behind that. So they came to him, he signed it, and then they petitioned the courts. He starts getting hate around Hartford for signing that thing. He talks about it in the appendix, about how he was being treated in Hartford after signing this writ, this petition. And the enslaver was a man named James Bullock and his wife Martha. They were from Savannah, Georgia. They came to Hartford just to have their two sons go to school here. And so they were planning to stay here for a couple years while their sons were being taught. They brought with them their small daughter. Her name was Anna. She was like 2. And then 2 years in, his wife Martha becomes pregnant, and they're now planning to go back to Georgia. And it was at that point when Nancy Jackson, a young enslaved woman that they brought with them, was now going to be taken back to Georgia and did not want to go back. And so that's how this all starts, the piece he writes in his book. And so they go to William Ellsworth. He writes up the writ. They serve it to the court. That abolitionist that started this, his name was Reverend Edward Tyler. We don't have images of him, and we don't have images of Nancy. I kind of see them as the primaries in this. Like Nancy was enduring. She was now going to have to face her enslaver. Reverend Tyler was the one that initiated it and pursued it. But here in Connecticut, when this story is told, you kind of hear about James Mars and William Ellsworth. This is kind of the piece at the back of James Mars's book that just talks about exactly what I told you guys. And if you go to this Connecticut Old State House today, they tell this whole story. They tell the same story. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Connecticut Supreme Court, in a 3-2 vote, voted that it wasn't illegal. You were here too long. Now you're a resident. So thus, now Nancy's free. So Nancy was freed in 1837. And James and Martha Bullock now had to go back to Georgia without Nancy. And Nancy moved to New York. That's the whole story told here in Connecticut. And so as I learned all of that, it was often told to me, oh, have you ever heard about the Nancy Jackson story? And my mind would always think, like, well, yeah, but you're just telling like a month of her life. Like, is that really her story? You know what I mean? Like, what if we just, somebody years from now was going to tell your life story, and they just told about everything you did in June 2025? You know what I mean? Like, it just didn't align to me. Every time I'd hear this story about Nancy Jackson, they would tell me about this 1 month of her life. So I was like, I need to learn more about Nancy Jackson. So I found where she was buried. She's buried in Brooklyn, New York. So I went down there. When I got there, the picture on the right, I'm standing right at her stone. It had fallen over decades ago. So it had just been laying flat for decades. So I stood it up and just took a picture next to it. And I worked with the cemetery to install a base for it. Our nonprofit paid $800 to install a base and get it cleaned as much as we could. So now it's in a base, and now you could read it, right? And so when I could read it, I was like, who are these other people? Rachel Monroe, William Simpson, Charlotte Simpson, who are they, right? So I contacted the Georgia Historical Society, and they were like, John, I think I got a book that might help you out. They sent me this manuscript of this woman who wrote a book about the Bullock Mansion in Roswell, Georgia. And there was an enslaved woman there named Charlotte. And this woman talked about how her family had visited this woman named Catherine Elliott Server, a family member of the Bullocks, had visited in the 1800s. And they had talked to this woman named Charlotte, who was enslaved there. And she was talking about how abolitionists in the North stole her daughter. That she's talking about Nancy, right? So that's when I realized, oh, I got her mother's name. Her mother's name is Charlotte. I also learned who I thought, at the time, they talked about Charlotte was married to a man named Luke Monroe. So now I had her father. So like I was slowly piecing this together. I'm like, who else do we have in her family, right? And so I just dug and dug more death certificates, more birth certificates, more death records, and I ended up building out a lot of people. Here's Nancy. I learned that she had a brother named William, who was also slave to the Bullocks. I learned that she had a brother named Sandy Monroe, who was also enslaved to the Bullocks. She also had a sister named Grace Monroe. Now, on that gravestone, we saw Rachel Monroe. That was her brother's wife. So then I had to process it. Wait a minute. She was freed in 1837, went to New York. All of these other people were still enslaved in Georgia. So after Juneteenth, so some 30 years later, they came to New York to live with her, right? And so that was wild to me. I also learned that her father was someone other than the man I knew her mother was married to, Luke Monroe. But she had other half-brothers and sisters that was their father. They just all shared the same mother, right? So now I had all these people. But the most fascinating thing about the story to me was James and Martha Bullock were the grandparents of President Teddy Roosevelt. And that baby that Martha was pregnant with when Nancy was freed was Teddy Roosevelt's mother, Martha Bullock Roosevelt. So this was not just a story of enslavement and Nancy gaining her freedom. It was a story directly tied to the presidency, right? And that is never told here in Connecticut either, which is interesting to me. I don't know what that's all about. I found another book that was written by Teddy Roosevelt's sister. Her name was Corinne. And in the book, she talks about Charlotte and Luke, Nancy's mother and stepfather. She talks about how on Sundays, Charlotte would walk to church with all the other enslaved individuals, but she would not let Luke walk alongside her because she was very fair-skinned, and that made her more valuable than him. And so he couldn't be next to her. Now, in the house and in the slave quarters, they were cool. But in public, he got to be back there. And then Corinne speaks in here like, I don't know why she did that. And I'm thinking, I know exactly why she did it. Right? I'm thinking that was my mind. Right? It made me realize this is a long historic thing that I came to a conclusion my mind had in the 90s, right? Deep. When Nancy went to New York, she started working for the Gray family. And they had a son named John Gray. He ended up being an appellate court judge, but he was young when she started working for them. And they would send him to school in France and Germany, and they would bring Nancy, because Nancy had to take care of the young kids. Same situation she was in when she was enslaved. Just now she's just doing it, but she's not enslaved. So now she's traveling with the Gray family, taking care of their little kids. In 1902, so she's older now, right? She writes this letter to Teddy Roosevelt. And she decides she wanted to connect with him and tell the story of how she was enslaved to his family and how she was supposed to be the assigned enslaved person to his mother. She also talks about running into his mother in New York, because they lived in New York. That's where Teddy Roosevelt grew up. They moved to New York. And she talked about running into his mother and about how his mother always wanted to read her diaries of her travels with the Gray family, and about how his mother invited her to the wedding of his sister. And so she talks about all this stuff in the letter and sends him the letter. He kept it, and it's in the National Archives now. Another piece of this story I've never, ever heard told anywhere here in Connecticut, ever. Like, you guys process why that is. I don't know why that is. I've never heard any of this. It's in the National Archives. I also learned that in 1905, Teddy Roosevelt wanted to see, where did my mother grow up? She talks about where she grew up all the time, and she talked about it fondly. Back then, they would assign an enslaved person to each of their children, and so that person had to sleep at the foot of their child's bed. When the child went to school, the black child had to sit on the stoop of the church of the school, waiting for them to get out of school. So they had to be assigned, they were assigned. So his mother would talk about these two black children that were assigned to her. And their names were Grace and William. Those are Nancy's brother and sister. So Teddy Roosevelt wanted to meet them, wanted to see the mansion, wanted to see where his mother grew up. He grew up in New York. He didn't know anything about it. So he goes to Roswell, Georgia in 1905. And the media is there, and they're taking all kinds of pictures. And right in the pictures, right in the Brooklyn newspaper as well, by the way. So Nancy would have been sitting at home and would have saw the president and her brother and sister, like right in the paper. There's Teddy in the middle. There's her sister Grace. Far right is her brother William. They're no longer enslaved. They had to bring them back to the house so that he could meet them and position them and present them from that time when they were enslaved. I wanted to give Grace and William and Nancy a much broader platform, a much bigger picture of their life. I mean, Nancy died, she was 93 years old. We telling 1 month of her story. Like, I wanted to broaden that. So I wrote an entire research summary on her family. I sent it to the Georgia Historical Society. I sent it to the Roswell Historical Society. There was a whole bunch of stuff in it they knew nothing about. I learned that in the Bullock Mansion today, which is a museum, they would walk, as they toured people through that place, the story they told up until 8 years ago was that Nancy in Connecticut was freed willingly and given money and a job, and they told her to be well. So in that museum, they told nothing about the fact that they got sued and she won her freedom. And so 8 years ago, they realized they'd been doing that for decades, and they stopped. And I think that story just came from the fact that the family was embarrassed by that. And so that just was the story they passed down. And so the Historical Society wasn't doing anything devious. They just were telling the story that had come through history. But it was just completely wrong. I found current day descendants, because that's what my nonprofit does. We find current day descendants, and then we give them back their history. So I found them. They lived within 10 miles of the mansion, knew nothing about it. So I went down there with them, and we walked through it together. That's us standing right in the same location where you saw Teddy Roosevelt, right in front of the mansion. It's funny, we walked through the tour with the Daughters of the Confederacy. it was wild because you hear them speaking and all this pride of all the attire and the nice detailing and the furniture, and they're all prideful as they walk through. But as we're walking through, we're also pointing out, well, you know, your family couldn't walk up those stairs. They went up those back stairs. You know, what room, where did my family, no. They was in the slave quarters in the back, right? And so, of course, then they were like, well, we want to go to see the slave quarters, and we don't care about none of this stuff in here, right? And so we eventually got to that point, and the Daughters of the Confederacy didn't go with us. But we went to the slave quarters, and a panel right on the wall in the slave quarters had all the enslaved people, including Nancy, their names. They then told me while the tour guide was standing there, they said, I wish, you know, I would love for our family to be able to pull our money and buy this place. And I was like, why? And they said, oh, so we can just burn it down. You could, the shock on the person's face that ran the tour, it even threw me for a moment. I was like, oh my goodness, could we have saved that for me? But I understood, right? They're learning about their family for the first time, and they're really learning it from a context of being demeaned, constantly demeaned, right? So that's what we do. That's the work we do. Identify a subject, do deep research into them of that time. Then we do research into the historical context. What was it like around them during that time? What was the environment like? What was going on in history at that time? Then we do the reverse genealogy to find the current day descendants. Then we do narrative writing. It's like, okay, you've got all these primary sources. What story does that tell? How would you write their life story? And then after we do that, our reparations is to give the descendants back all that history, and then we try to inject them into the community. Like, it's my belief that like all of this stuff anybody can contribute to, anybody. But as soon as we get to for me, that's the black community, an African American that lives in that location, or the family. Like, those are the people I'm using when I'm writing the narrative. Like, because it's their experience that informs the narrative, right? So that's our process. Like lots of people help me with all these other steps. But right here, it's the people that were most impacted that helped me write the narrative. We did a lot for Prince. We've got a panel installed at Old Newgate Prison. So if you go out there, you'll see that panel that we've got installed there that tell his story. If you go inside, we had a commissioned portrait made of Prince Mortimer. You'll see that inside. We got a street named after Prince Mortimer in Middletown. So we've done a lot with Prince. We did a lot with the man Fortune in Waterbury, formerly enslaved man down there whose body was used for medical science right after his death. Taught a lot of people, a lot of doctors of Preserve Porter, his enslaver's family, the field of medicine, and bone medicine specifically. But he was not a part of that community. So we had a mural painted, $30,000 mural painted in that community. So if you're in that community, you're in the right place. Right around where he lived, you're gonna see his face. So questions will be asked, right? I did another project in New Haven for an African-American man who fought in the Civil War. His name was Alexander Newton. His family was enslaved in the South. His mother ran away to New York to raise money to free her husband, and then she had like 3 sons who fought in the Civil War while they lived in Connecticut. And it was through that story, I found that family, that the Kelly Clarkson show picked up the work we were doing. So last Juneteenth, I was on her show talking about that family and their descendants and their learning about their history for the first time and what we did to inject them into the community. I do a lot now also as it relates to military people from this state relative to the Civil War. And I do that because there's a context with regards to who they were that is all wrong, and I don't think it's intentional. Again, I just think it was erased, and then people have just kind of replicated the false narrative. And I'll try to quickly tell you that. In 1792, shortly after the Revolutionary War, the Militia Act was signed into law. It basically was a structure for how states created state militias, but it had a limitation in it. It was like, but you can't be black. You got to be white to be in a state militia. Keep that context. In 1818, Connecticut realizes that they don't have a state constitution. They were like, we got to create a state constitution. And in 1784, Connecticut had started gradual emancipation. So now you have a lot of black people that are slowly being freed. And once they're freed, they're buying land. And as soon as they get land, they can vote. So the state of Connecticut was like, well, we got to create a state constitution. Well, you know one thing we want to solve for? All these black people voting. So in their state constitution, they made a requirement that you have to be white to vote in 1818. So keep that context. In 1857, in Missouri, the Dred Scott case, African-American man taken across the borders, had the legality now to sue for his freedom. He sues for it. It goes to Supreme Court. Supreme Court rules that, wait a minute, you can't bring a court case to us because a black person cannot ever be a citizen. Thus, you can't bring a court case here. So the ruling essentially is black people couldn't, not essentially, is black people are not citizens of the United States. So that was in 1857. So in Connecticut, in context, you can't fight in the state militia, can't vote, and you're not a citizen, okay? And so the Civil War starts in 1861. It's not going so well. Huge, horrible battle, 7 days battle in Virginia, lots of casualties. Lincoln's trying to figure out how to stop the Confederate States from continuing this mission. So he passes two things. He passed the Confiscation Act in 1862, which is basically like if we capture something, it's now ours. So if there's slaves there, they're now free, and we now own that building, right? And then the second thing he passes is the Militia Act of 1862. It was meant to correct the Militia Act of 1792 that said you had to be white to fight in the state militia. So he removed that. He was like, oh, well, you can be black now. And you can serve in anything you're competent to serve in. All right, and so by doing that, also in that Militia Act, it says, but if you do decide to serve, you can be paid $10 minus $3 for your clothes. Right, so you get $7 a month. The problem with that is white soldiers were getting $13 a month, and they weren't being charged for their clothes. So the Militia Act was basically saying, we're going to let you fight, but you're getting paid half. And so states still didn't really want, northern states still didn't want black people in their militias. So it's not like they were enlisting them. Some did in the South. Southern portions that were controlled by the Union, regiments were created of only enslaved people that fought for the Union. But for the most part, in northern states, these states were not putting black people in the army. So another big battle of Antietam in September 1862, all kinds of casualties, another problem. And so in September, Lincoln says, okay, we got to stop this. Here's the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. If you don't stop this, I'm just like ending slavery in the South. Remember, I said in the South. It didn't end slavery if you were in a border state. That's another piece that's missing when people tell this story. I mean, Juneteenth came, and the people in the South were freed, but there were still border states that continued slavery until December. That's just something people don't tend to know. But anyway, the Confederates don't give up the cause. So in January of 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect, and it's more explicit about, wait, black people can fight. They can do these roles. It's much more explicit than the Militia Act was. And so he also then in March passes the Enrollment Act, which is a draft. So I told you black people can fight, and your numbers of the people you need to supply by state are now higher. And so because of that, now northern states are like, okay, so then they start creating these colored regiments. They didn't want them fighting with the white men. So they created regiments, all black men, led by white officers, right? So that starts happening February, March 1863. Not in Connecticut, though. That's happening in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Connecticut was like not with that idea at all. Until November of 1863, the federal government is like, you guys are 1,700 men, Connecticut, short of your quota. And if you don't give us those 1,700 men by January 5th, we're going to penalize you. It's going to be more men that you're going to have to give us. And so that was a problem. So in the Connecticut legislature, they're like, why don't we just start a colored regiment? And people in the Connecticut legislature were like, that is the craziest thing we've ever heard. William Eaton is he was the chief judge in Hartford at the time. He's like, that's the vilest bill ever to come across the Connecticut legislature. He would sooner let loose the wild Comanche than the ferocious Negro. They're going to invade the homes of their former masters with lust, raping, and murder. Like that was the common context here in Connecticut. And so, but they had no choice. Lincoln was like, no, we need more men. So on November 18th, 1863, they finally started colored regiments, the 29th Connecticut Colored Regiment. They organized in New Haven. There are two men that wrote books about being in Connecticut's 29th Colored Regiment. A man by the name of Alexander Newton, another man by the name of Isaac J. Hill. They talk a lot about their accounts. Isaac J. Hill's book came out in 1867, like within 2 years after the Civil War. I mean, it was fresh in his mind, right? He talks about how when they were organized, they were about to be deployed in March, right? The black men that had enlisted there were not giving their sign-on bonus. There was a bonus or a bounty that they were promised. They weren't given that bonus, and they were angry. And so the flag was presented, and these, at the time, would have been 1,400 men refused to acknowledge it. Where have you ever heard of something like that before? Now, I know you heard about Colin Kaepernick. I know you heard about Colin Kaepernick. Another guy who did that in the NBA in the early 90s. His name was Chris Jackson. He changed his name to, I can't remember what he changed his name to. Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. He did the same thing, right? But I bet y'all didn't know that 1,400 men from Connecticut did that way before all of them, way before the 1968 Olympics, and way before all that. There were men right here that did that. Why don't y'all know that?
Well, what about the Massachusetts 54th?
The 54th protested as well.
The history doesn't tell us that.
That's what's kind of disappointing. They don't tell you that. The Massachusetts, the 54th protest was even more impactful than that. I'll tell you.
Now, they were in battle.
Well, all of these men were in battle. But what was even more impactful by the 54th protest is when the paymaster showed up to pay them that little $7 a month, every black man in the regiment said, we don't even want it. That was such a slap in the face, the 54th men didn't even take it. Like their protest was even bigger. So yes, there's more. I could go on and on about the 54th. But anyway, you're gonna get me talking on something else. Let's go get back to the program. Isaac also talked about in his book about being in the Richmond-Peterborough campaign, and he was at his station, and a man got shot in the head, and nobody was attended to him. So he runs over to this black man, he puts him against a tree, but he has to get back. So he fights. Hours and hours later, he comes back, nobody's attended to the black man. So he was like, he realized very quickly. See, these regiments fought alongside other white regiments. And he realized really quickly that the medics, if you were black, you might not get as good a treatment as you're wounded, right? And he talks to that in that book. He knew that. He also talks about, okay, in October 1865, they're on outpost. The Civil War is over. They're just on outpost duty in Texas. And now they're being sent back to Connecticut. By the way, the 29th is the first regiment to enter the burning capital of the Confederacy, Richmond. They're the first one, our 29th Connecticut Colored Regiment. They walked in, the city's burning. They stay there until President Lincoln shows up to tour the devastation. The 29th watch him walk in. So our 29th Connecticut Color Regiment is a heroic, historic regiment that nobody knows any of this here in this state. They're on this ship. They get to New Orleans, they get off the ship in New Orleans, they're given a parade in New Orleans. They get back on the ship, they go to New York. They're in New York, they're given a parade in New York. They walk down Broadway, they talk about passing the St. Nicholas Hotel, they talk about going to Central Park and being given refreshments, people cheering them on. While they're in New York, they learn that Connecticut had put it up for vote a month prior in October. Should we change our 1818 state constitution? I mean, we had all these black men that just fought for us because we couldn't get enough white men. So why should we have it saying they can't vote? Should we change that? So they put it up for public vote. And it was voted, the citizens of Connecticut voted it down. They were like, no, we don't want black men voting. So they learn about that as they're coming back to Connecticut. They're in New York, they're almost here. So Isaac J. Hill writes in his book, he was like, the boys of the 29th were feeling somewhat indignant in reference to the treatment they received from their state, it not giving them their rights. Like, they were upset. They didn't even want to come back to Connecticut. Have you ever heard that story? No. You know, I already know the answer to that. I already know. So they get here. They get to the old, they get to Hartford. They walk up to the Connecticut Old State House, which still stands, right? It's a museum today. They stand at the Connecticut Old State House. Governor Buckingham talks to them, basically apologizing for the fact that the state just voted that they can't vote, even though they fought because they couldn't get enough white men to enlist, right? And so he's like apologizing to them, telling them to be patient, that, you know, one day you get your rights. And so then they go through a parade route. I know all the streets they turned down. It's in the papers of that day. I know exactly the route they took. But today, if you go walk that route, or if you just go to the Connecticut Old State House, there's no mention they were ever there. I think that's a travesty. I think that's a problem, right? And so I've been working with the Old State House on that for 3 years now. We're still trying to fight that. And so we'll see if at one point we'll get them mentioned there. That guy, Isaac J. Hill, who wrote that book, he was actually from New Jersey. He just heard Connecticut was creating a colored regiment, so he raced to Connecticut, fought, and then he went back home. He went back to New Jersey. So I was like, where is he buried? Well, he buried under that parking lot over there. It's an African-American cemetery that was paved over in the 1960s. And the stones that were in that cemetery were moved a mile away, and they're lined up against a fence at the back of an Episcopal cemetery, about a mile down the street. So I contacted the town, I worked with the cemetery, I worked with a bunch of people. No one in the town knew the story. I found his current day descendants. They lived literally within a few blocks of where he lived and didn't know anything about him. So I gave them the book, this book that had been published for 140 years about their family member that they knew nothing about. And so their Senator Cory Booker wrote a letter for our ceremony. The city council there, we created a big, huge bash for him in Woodbury, New Jersey. We got the VA to give us another headstone. And now in their historical society, there's a whole display dedicated to Isaac J. Hill, when prior to us walking into that town, they didn't know anything about him. Sadly enough, in New Haven, there's a monument that honors the 29th at Crisqualo Park. It's bittersweet to me because they couldn't get the state to sponsor it, so descendants had to sponsor it. And so they spent a lot of money on that monument. But the problem with the monument is it has 1,000 names on it. But there were 1,700 men that organized at Crisqualo Park. There's 700 men missing. Also, every time a white officer promoted, that white officer's name is replicated on that monument. And so there's like all these problems with regards to the monument. So I've been trying to work to get that corrected as well. Isaac J. Hill is missing from that monument as well. a story specific. As I learned these things, I started to realize that, you know, when you start talking about military stories here in Connecticut, you start to see some of these images of value, right? Because that was a big thing here in Connecticut. So I pay a lot of attention to the families of the formerly enslaved and their stories relative to the military here in Connecticut. There was a story of a man named Leverett Holden. The Avon Historical Society was planning a celebration of him. And it was very light what they knew. They had been researching him for some 14 years. What they knew was he was born in Vernon, because that's in his enlistment papers when he joined the 29th Connecticut Colored Regiment. They knew that he shows up in the 1850 census living with the Wadsworths and the Loomises in Hartford. He would have been 25 by then. Then he shows up in this area in Avon living with this mulatto couple and other families that are like mixed race couples. He's living around these people and with them. And then all of a sudden, you know, that was in 1870. He shows up after the war around these people. So that's about all they knew. They had a resident in Avon that had written a diary back when Leverett was alive, talked about knowing him. So they had details about how fun-loving of a guy he was. So they were planning to honor him because he has a stone at the cemetery next to Avon Congregational Church. And so they asked me to speak at their memorial. And so I said, yeah, but you know, the work I do is I give stuff back to their current day descendants. So like, you got them coming, right? And they said, he didn't have no current day descendants. I was like, okay, I'm gonna try to figure that out. But yeah, I'll speak. So me and my wife went on this blitz, this 2-week blitz, to try to find as much as we can on Leverett Holden so we can tell a broader story and potentially invite his descendants to this celebration. And so we start digging. You know, we looked at his enlistment documents. It said what they told me, that he was born in 1825, and that he joined at 38 years old, and that he was born in Vernon, just like they said. We continued to dig a little deeper, and we realized this was like a much bigger story. There was this guy that lived in Warwick, Rhode Island. His name was Randall Holden. He was from Salisbury, England. And he came to the New World in the mid-1600s, him and his brother. And his brother went up to Massachusetts and founded the town of Groton, Massachusetts. And he founded, Randall was amongst many men who were the initial founders of Warwick, Rhode Island. And he had many kids and grandkids, and his kids and grandkids enslaved many people in Warwick, Rhode Island. Two of the people they enslaved were this man named Cato and this other man named Prince. And at some point, Cato and Prince are freed, and they start going by the name Prince Holden. But then there was this other guy that shows up. His name is George Holden, right? So he was enslaved to the same family in Warwick, Rhode Island. And I see this George Holden in 1790, and then I see him again in Warwick, Rhode Island. I see him in 1790, but then in 1800, George Holden is gone. And so then I'm like, okay, where'd George Holden go? I end up finding him in Ellington. So he gets freed in Rhode Island. He moves to Ellington once he's freed. And I saw that once he got to Ellington, he married this woman named Nancy Hill. And he has 5 children. And then Nancy dies in 1812. I then found that I now had like this picture of this George Holden's family, right? I had his wife, I had his 5 kids, I had their names, I had all this information about them. So I started digging a little further, and then I saw him still in Ellington in 1810. But by 1820, he's now in Vernon. Now, I knew Vernon because that's where Leverett Holden was from, right? Now this George Holden's in Vernon. So then I started digging into like, okay, well, how many Holdens, black people named Holden, are in Vernon? Turns out he was the only one. Not only was he the only one in Vernon, he was the only black person with a surname Holden in all of New London County. So I'm pretty sure that's Leverett's family, right? And so I did a little more digging. I started to look at the Barber collection as a list of books that were produced that aggregate church, marriage, birth records from all the towns across Connecticut. So that you don't have to do all the legwork. You just look through the book that's for that town, and then you could see, right? They did one for pretty much every town in Connecticut, but when I looked for the book for Vernon, they don't have one for Vernon. So then I was like, oh, man. So me and my wife have to go down to the state library. And at the state library, we're just like digging through records. And I eventually find out that after his wife died, George Holden marries this woman named Sylvia in Vernon. And then it lists all the children he then now had of the second wife. It's another 5 children. So now he has like 10 children, 5 from the first wife, 5 from the second wife. The youngest of them are this boy named Emmerich and another one named Everett. And I went, that's Leverett. It's the same year, it's the same place, it's the only Holden family. I think I found them. And so then now I had like a tree that was bigger. I had his 2 wives, I had the 5 kids from the first wife, the 5 kids, and Leverett as the youngest, right? Then I learned that his oldest daughter, Asenath, moved to Windsor in 1820. So Asenath is here. Within 5 years of that, George Holden moves here too. So Leverett Holden is an Avon story, but he grew up here in Windsor. He lived here from probably somewhere under his 5th birthday. Because it's just the 5th birthday where I see the census that they're in Windsor. So I don't know, he could have been here as early as his 1st or 2nd birthday. I don't know, it's somewhere before 5. They moved here to Windsor. And so I see him here in 1830. All of a sudden in 1840, George Holden's gone. I think he died. So I think he passed away. But then I see Leverett in 1850. Now he's 25, and he's living, as I said earlier, with the Wadsworths and the Loomises in Hartford, which was odd to me, like this prestigious family. Like, why is Leverett with that family, right? But then I realized, being raised here in Windsor, he grew up around the Loomises. He went to the same church. He was like right with them. Also, I don't know if I have that on here. I may. Yeah, I'll show you in a second. He had nephews that were also living with the Loomises. On the right is his brother Oliver, who was living in Hartford, and his mother Sylvia is living with his brother. So his father dies, mother's living with his brother in Hartford. This is really hard to see, but in 1860, he looks like he has a family. He's with this, living in Avon, he's with this woman named Mary Holden, and he had these children, Sarah and Mary. Now the story told in Avon is that he never married, never had any children. But the census seems to contradict that from 1860. It looks to me like he had a wife and children. That Mary, the census taker, this column here, it's supposed to say whether you're mulatto, black, or white. Blank means you're white. You see above it, there's M's for the family lived next door. They're mulatto. But you see that column suggests that Leverett, his wife Mary, and his kids are all white. Well, that's not right, but I think it is right. You know, the census is taken by the person who's home to give the information at the time. I don't think Leverett was there and his wife gave the information, and thus the census taker just thought everybody was white, because I think his wife was white. Does that make sense? That's what I think happened. So back to Mary. Same census in Windsor. Mary's parents, James and Fanny Loomis. Mary's listed in that household, but are they the same Mary? Are this different Mary? Is Mary Loomis Mary Holden? Like, my mind was starting to think that they're the same age, and Leverett's nephews in their house. I still think that's the same person. I think Mary Loomis is Mary Holden. I think that's a hidden secret that somebody doesn't want known. Leverett goes off to war in March of 1864. In April 1864, Mary Loomis dies. And so when he returns back home, the household that he's in, there's no Mary Holden. Yeah, I know, because Mary Loomis died. That's my interpretation. I'm still working to get all the primary sources to kind of prove that out. But I think there's some intent there as to why these two people die at the same time, and I think there's something there. Another story that I think relates, that's research I've done, by the way, we did a big ceremony celebrating Leverett, and I read through his life story, including his father's enslavement in Rhode Island. I read through his brothers and sisters. I read through where his nieces and nephews lived. I read through his upbringing here in Windsor. And so the people of Avon got to hear a lot about his time here in Windsor last week at the dedication for his memorial stone. This is another story that I find really interesting. There's another family that I've been researching that's related to a guy named John Griffin, who was considered like an early settler here in Windsor. He in the 1600s, the colonies were trying to figure out a way to stop the Native Americans from pushing back against white Americans encroaching on their property. And so they passed these laws, one of which was if a Native American destroys your property because they're upset that you're taking land, if they destroy your property, then you can bring them to court and we will sentence them to either some nominal number that they have to pay, and if they can't pay it, they become your enslaved person, and you have two options. You can put them to work for you, or you can ship them to the West Indies and trade for a black person. Wow. So those were your options, right? And so this John Griffin here in Windsor, a Native American man named Manahanus burned some of his property. So he goes to the courts, and the courts did just that. They said, okay, he has to pay 500 fathoms for that, and if he can't pay it, he's your enslaved person. Well, the Native Americans, he was like an elder, and they knew that John Griffin wasn't going to enslave him here. He would have shipped him out. The reason they shipped them out is because the Native Americans knew the terrain, and they had backup. They had family. They would just break them out, right? And so it wasn't profitable to just continue to enslave Native Americans. They knew the terrain too well. And so there was a process of sending Native Americans through Hartford, ship them to the West Indies, trade them for a black person, bring them back, enslave the black person. So that was the process. And so these Native Americans knew that was about to happen. Their elder was about to be sent to the West Indies. And so they didn't want that to happen, so they made a side deal with John Griffin. They were like, we can't pay you that money, but we'll just give you all of our land in return. And their tribal land was called Masako. So they gave John Griffin almost all of Masako. What's interesting about, and so then he released Manahanus. What's interesting about that is Masako has a different name today, but it's a place you would know. Masako is Simsbury. They gave John Griffin all of Simsbury, right? And so that wasn't a legal tender. Like again, the court said you can enslave him, you can have him pay you, or you can enslave him. They didn't say you can make some side deal and take all their land. And so some 30 years later, the courts were like, you acquired all that land illegally. So they took all of Simsbury back from John Griffin. But they didn't give it back to the Native Americans. They started doling it out to other white Americans, right? But that's the city of Simsbury. I'm telling you this story because I was researching this guy. His name was Peter Jackson. I was at his headstone. His headstone, it's a black man. His headstone is in Simsbury Cemetery. And the story was that he was enslaved in the mid-1700s in the West Indies. And he was traded for a Native American and brought here to be enslaved in Simsbury. Same kind of concept. And then he married this woman named Esther Wallace. And Esther Wallace was the daughter of a man named London Wallace, who was from Windsor, right? And so I was like digging for a year trying to build out all of this, specifically because Peter and Esther had 7 grandsons who fought in the Civil War. 6 of them died. And they're not honored anywhere. It's like they never were there. I also learned in my research that London Wallace fought in the French and Indian War while he was enslaved. And he had 3 sons, Zebulon, Joseph, and London, that fought in the Revolutionary War. And so this is kind of a historic black family from Windsor, Simsbury, right, that no one knows about. Like they got service in the French and Indian, they got all these men that served in the Revolution, they got all these men who served and died in the Civil War in black regiments. And so like I wanted to like honor them. Like these are the 6 men at the bottom highlighted that died during the Civil War. The 7th on the bottom, Gilbert, he served as well, but he came back from war. They served in different regiments, because remember I was telling you earlier, Connecticut took a long time to start a colored regiment, so some of them left. One went to Massachusetts to fight with the 54th. Another one went to Rhode Island to fight with the 14th Heavy Artillery Regiment. Some of them stayed and waited, and when Connecticut started the 29th, they joined that. So they're from here, but they're fighting all over the place. And they died, never made it back. They're stones, they're buried different places. They just were never celebrated the same, but they're the same family. And so we've got a ceremony that's going to be occurring on June 19th at 10 a.m. at Eno Memorial Hall in Simsbury to celebrate that entire family. That family that was enslaved to the family that owned all of Simsbury at one point. We're going to celebrate that whole family. I found the current day descendants. They live in North Carolina. They're flying in. So we're gonna tell them their story for the first time that day as well. Just changing the narrative, changing who we give reverence to, changing how we paint the picture of the formerly enslaved, making sure that we see them with reverence as well. I also have like a book that I'm writing with Dennis Karen. Remember that guy I told you about that wrote that book about Prince Mortimer? And we had a difference of opinion on what was important in the book. Well, he started hearing my perception, and he reached out, and he was like, well, you want to help me rewrite it? I was like, okay, let's rewrite it. So we did that. So I have a chapter in there, and I wrote like 6 or 7 pages of the foreword, and I've injected in my research into the book. And so we're still, with a couple publishers that he's still working with, but as soon as that happens, I'll publicize where that's going to be at. But anyway, we're doing this across the state. If you want to know more information about us, please go to alexbreanne.org, and you can learn more about our projects. You can learn more about what we're doing. We've got a mural going up in Norwich. We've got stuff all over the state. And we're still working in Brooklyn with Nancy Jackson's case. So yeah, check it out if you guys have any interest. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you for your time. Yes. Thank you.